Let me also remind you, because related material always helps, that the American Journal of the Theosophical Society, which is issued about 4 or 5 times a year and which is called Quest, in the present issue has a very fine article on Louis Claude de Saint-Martin and the French tradition, and it even has an old article of mine that was deemed relevant and republished again. So if you can't get hold of it, you tell me and we'll order a few more copies. In any event, this is the one, and there are some more than usually interesting material in it this time. Now, as we have indicated before in our little series on the sources of the esoteric tradition, that the great revival of esoterica in our culture, which primarily occurred in the middle and the latter part of the 19th century, was greatly influenced by the English language, the English-speaking public, because the 19th century occult revival was pioneered and carried forward, although subsequently perhaps much of the material was also handed over to others by the Theosophical Society, which was founded in New York City, in English-speaking country, in 1875 by 2 American citizens, one a Connecticut Yankee, Colonel Olcott, and the other a naturalized citizen of Russian noble provenance, namely Madame Blavatsky. So let's say from then on, and by way of the British and ultimately the British Indian connections, the English language was very much a sort of a lingua franca of the 19th century occult revival. It is far less well known that a very significant revival of the esoteric tradition also occurred in France, and that is the one which we will try to review this evening. In order to keep that in mind, we need to remember, first of all, that the geographical distance, of course, then or now, between England and France is minimal, and therefore various people, including Blavatsky herself, went frequently to France and had all kinds of contacts there. So that if we are looking for any country, let's say in Europe, other than England itself, which was very directly exposed to the occult revival of the late of the 19th century, then we justly can look for France. And I will try to convey that as well as I can by way of telling about some of the figures who were the main teachers and writers within the French occult revival, and to indicate to some extent their influence on the general spiritual atmosphere. So it is really it is a very important element that should not be left out of one's studies. Now, in order to do this, I will have to also sort of apologize that such a review cannot really be undertaken without recounting, along with the material, a considerable amount of history. And it's unfortunately true that in most places, including in our contemporary Southern California, people don't seem to like history very much. And yet, let's say, especially when it comes to the entry or the re-entry into a culture of a certain long-lasting but frequently hidden tradition, the historical circumstances are often of considerable relevance, and so you will need to excuse me if I will mix historical detail in with the theory. Now, that being the case, let's try to take a look at the fair country of France from the time that we have some records of it, which is from Roman sources, particularly from a very important Roman source, namely Julius Caesar, who wrote an entire book, De Bello Gallico, the Gallic Wars, and then subsequently he also wrote one called Britannia. Why? Because he was the Roman general. We will turn the air conditioner on again, don't worry, but it was blowing straight at me.
No, just on the fans.
Is there a problem? What is the problem, if there is a problem? None? Oh, well, that's very comforting, yeah. So let's say, what the fair country of France was known as Gaul, or Gallia in Latin, which literally means the land of the roosters. See, a gallus in Latin means rooster, and the heraldic animal, which was regarded as the symbol of the Gauls, of the French, was a rooster. So I don't know what great esoteric significance that may have, but I'm sure that there is one. In any event, the land of the roosters became very important to the Roman Empire after Caesar conquered it, and it became a very important portion of the Western culture, and within Western culture also to some extent of the esoteric tradition. Now, we have very little information, probably because it is not really obtainable in any detail of what kind of religious or spiritual original background there existed in France. So we know that it was the spiritual traditions of the Gauls were related in many ways to the similar spiritual traditions over on the other side of the ocean in England. In fact, when I was trying to prepare some of this material, it occurred to me that I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. First of all, it was in French language, but there was a very, very funny series of cartoon books some years ago, which all dealt with the interaction of the Romans and the Gauls, and it had spawned such interesting figures as the bard of the Gauls who was doing the singing, whose name was Cacophonix. And there was Cacophonix, and the little dog who always appeared, whose name was Idefix. And when they all ended in IX, in Gallic fashion. So let us say the Roman conquest of Gaul has been documented even in cartoons, which is quite interesting. In other ways, prior to the coming of Christianity, we really have very little information. Especially if we disregard or at least pay minimal attention to a sort of scholarly bypass which produced all kinds of excitement in the earlier period of our own history, which had to do with what started out with the writings, with two books of an English scholar of cultural anthropology, Margaret Alice Murray, who wrote two books called The God of the Witches and Witchcraft in Western Europe. Now, inasmuch as France is in Western Europe, I felt that the approach to the spiritual background of Professor Murray may be relevant to some extent to our purposes. But I will not spend much time on it because the actual topical connections and relevance of these prehistoric religious cults that existed apparently in England and also in Western Europe is really not very great. But you need to remember that the entire, if you are indeed interested, that a considerable amount of excitement in the beginning with the mid-1950s and proceeding to the 60s, to the 70s, to the 80s, having to do with witchcraft and the revival of witchcraft was all originated by these books. However, I am fairly familiar with the exegesis that various people have undertaken, and I don't see much of a connection between this witchery and the subsequent existence and revival of the esoteric tradition in France. But it's important to remember that there was such a thing. So that being the case, I should pay him some respect because I was contacted by him and I actually had a letter from him I think a few days prior to his demise. The thesis of Margaret Murray was picked up by an English gentleman by the name of Gerald Brousseau Gardner, who became the reviver of witchcraft in modern times. He seemed to be a rather interesting man, but inasmuch as he only had time to write me about 2 letters before he went, I didn't find out all that much about him. But he was really not a lightweight, and his popularizing of Margaret Alice Murray's contribution, I think, was of some considerable value. So we might say that sort of archaic Stone Age spirituality had a foothold on the British Isles and in Western Europe for a considerable period of time, and such a foothold needs always to be understood as becoming then the launching pad for various future developments. And therefore, let's say, the archaic spirituality of the horned god, which was the god of the witches according to Margaret Murray and so forth, are of some importance, some relevance to our purposes as well. So then what we need to keep in mind that with the coming of the Romans, in a rather short period of time, the Roman Empire became more and more Christianized. The Christian religion was spreading, and France, or Gaul, was probably the first large Roman province that became very heavily converted to Christianity. And for a long time thereafter, France was referred to in religious circles as the elder daughter of the church because of that. So it was originally, let's say, a very heavily Christian religious country. Now, it had already fairly early in its history, however, let's say the French Christianity had some unusual features. And some of these can even be recognized today. And inasmuch as it is now, this is July, what's the date today?
22nd.
Yeah, 22nd. Well,
21st.
anyway, around this time, I don't have my calendar in front of me, but around this time, 22nd, 23rd of July, is the festival of Mary Magdalene in the Universal Church. Now, there is no country on the face of the earth, Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or other Christian, that has more places of worship devoted to Mary Magdalene than France, or as she is called in French, La Madeleine. This is in addition to one beautiful old church in Paris itself that is called the Madeleine. So from a very early time on, there were some curious currents which, upon closer observation, revealed themselves as having some esoteric elements that came into the religious history of France. For instance, people who are generally not known as being very Christian in their orientation, the gypsy people, whom I have some knowledge of because one of their large habitats was always in Hungary. The gypsy people have their own sacred traditions in France that are connected, among others, with Mary Magdalene. In the south of France, there is a particular spot on the ocean where the gypsy legends, and somewhat also endorsed by the non-gypsy people, are to the effect that in biblical times, 3 women, the 3 Marys, arrived there on a ship and disembarked and subsequently lived and died in France. And that they were the Virgin Mary, the Mother of the Lord, Mary Magdalene, and another Mary, who is often referred to as the Black Mary, or Afra, who was apparently of African origin, who was, well, one of the Marys. And the gypsies to this day, many gypsies, take long journeys from all over the world to gather at that particular spot in the south of France, where they are celebrating the arrival of the three Marys, whom they consider as being related to their people, at least in the person of Afra, the Black Mary, and whom they consider these holy women as being the patronesses of the gypsies. So there are all sorts of strange currents of tradition or legendary which exist in France, probably more in a more numerous fashion in the south of France than the rest of the country, but all over the country, which point to certain mysterious origins. And among these is the figure of Mary Magdalene, but also of some other feminine figures that subsequently became very important to the religious life there, and not only to the gypsies. So one has to have a certain kind of nose, if that is not too crude an expression, to smell esoterica in a country. And you can smell it in France. You may not be able to always localize it, to give it expression, to give it a complete scholarly description, but it is there. And the tradition of Mary Magdalene, who of course in recent years for a while was greatly touted by sort of, shall we put it, an unfortunate mythology that concentrated in such books as Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and others, which does not have any historical validity, but legendary and even mendacity regarding various matters very often still originates in something that has substance. And so there's I would say that there is a definite spiritual smell of an esoteric nature that prevails and always prevailed in certain regions of France, and which had a great deal of connection with the feminine principle, and which was connected with the Middle East, and probably ultimately with Egypt. And it may very well be that the subsequent esoteric currents that arose in France, and that we will refer to sometimes at greater length and sometimes not so great length, are due to these kinds of connection. So France always harbored a mystery. And where the mystery came from, what its exact nature was, is difficult to tell. But it would seem that the connections with ancient Egypt and some other homelands of the esoteric tradition existed, and from time to time revived again in France in some fashion or the other. So this needs to be kept in mind, that we already, with the coming of the Roman Empire and then with the coming of Christianity, there coincided a presence, tenuous, evanescent, very, very difficult to put your finger on it, but yet always there and discernible of an other, a transcendental esoteric tradition, which only from time to time had taken off a Christian, onto itself a Christian veneer. So these need to be kept in mind, so that there was a ground, there was a soil present in France, especially in the south of France, wherein strange esoteric plants of spirituality had a tendency to spring up and flourish, at least for a while, if sometimes not such a very long time, because of suppression. However, there was not too much overtly apparent of heterodox or esoteric spirituality until after the year 1000. You know, C.G. Jung had a theory, which I mentioned in some of his books, that he said that the Piscean age, which of course is said to start with the coming of Christianity, that the Piscean, the symbol of the sign of Pisces, which I think is easy to discern and to learn and to remember, is two fish who are swimming in the opposite direction. One of them is of a light color, the other one is of a dark color. And Jung said that, the zodiacal ages last, give or take a few hundred years, last about 2,000 years, 2,500 years or 2,000 years, and that they are divided into two. In the Piscean age, the light-colored fish, which comes first, is peaceful, and in Europe at least became Christian. When the dark-colored fish in the second millennium entered the picture, that was of a different nature. And so with the coming of the dark-colored fish, after the year 1000, as they enter the second thousand, there arose strange phenomena of a psycho-spiritual nature in France, which were not of which people didn't have too much of an intimation before, at least not openly. And probably the most important, there are two medieval manifestations of the esoteric tradition in France. And the first one that I'm mentioning now is the arising of the Cathar faith in what is now the south of France, in the so-called region of Languedoc, which means language of oak, because it was distinguished from the rest of France that the people there, when they said yes, didn't say oui, which is the French word, of course, for yes, but they said oak. Therefore, it's the Languedoc, it's the language of oak. In the Languedoc and neighboring regions, there arose a religion which, among other names, called itself the Cathar, or the religion of the pure ones, and which, when we study its teachings and its practices to the extent that some information is still available, was unadulterated and unmitigated Gnosticism, probably of a mildly Manichaean variety, which is a Gnostic school originating in Persia. So, and there it endured for a considerable period of time and became the source, let us say, of much of the esoteric traditions and orientations, not only in different parts of France, but really all over Europe. It is, for instance, part of the traditions. I heard about it fairly early in life when I was in my teens, that the Rosicrucian movement originated, this is of course legendary, the Rosicrucian movement, which is said to have originated by way of a German knight by the name of Christian Rosenkreuz, which just means the Christian Rosy Cross, was really a continuation, a re-embodiment of the Cathar tradition in a different country. And that Christian Rosenkreuz, who was born into a family named von Görmishausen, was an offspring of a family that was of Cathar origin. And that when the Cathars were exterminated in France, then a few of them managed to flee to Germany, and one of them was the Görmishausen family, of whose, incidentally, just by a curious coincidence, there was a representative, Sir Alvin Görmishausen, in whose house I was several times a guest, who lived up here on the upper end of Beechwood Drive. So the Görmishausen family is still alive. He, however, is no longer alive. But let us say it is quite possible, because such legends almost always have a kernel of objective truth in addition to a large dose of subjective and mythological truth. And so there is a good deal of likelihood that the Cathar tradition, which after a long period of time was cruelly extinguished by the northern French, led by the Catholic Church, and to which we always pay homage here on or around the 16th of March, which was one of the last great defeats of the Cathars, that this remained an important element in the French psyche. And moreover, that what happened to the Cathars in the Languedoc, along with another event somewhat later, became the seed not only of a certain continuity of esoteric traditions, but also of some very important elements in French history subsequently. So let's put it this way, that when it came to the sort of in the end of the 1200s, there was considerable, how should we put it, considerable anger and antagonism and horror all throughout France in various circles because of what had been done to the Cathars. And when in a later time period in the 20th century, the great historian and historical novelist Zoe Oldenburg wrote her book Le Boucher de Montségur, along with many other books, particularly historical novels. It was, let's say, common knowledge that the resentment against the Catholic Church and against certain substratum of French society was originated in the resentment against what happened to the Cathars. The entire kingdom of France received a serious wound, a wound that eventually ended up almost deadly because of the persecution of the Cathars. But this was not all. In addition to that, and not so very, not such a very long time subsequently, there also occurred something else. Along with the other European countries, France was involved in the Crusades. And by the way, I have nothing against the Crusades. I think there is a lot of bad publicity that exists even now, largely coming from Muslim sources about the Crusades, which is not really justified. Let's say there was good and sufficient reason for the European powers to hop over the Mediterranean and to try to establish a secure place for the large numbers of pilgrims that were going over to the Holy Land and which were routinely kidnapped, sold into slavery, and subjected to all kinds of indignities until finally the Crusades were organized in order to create a more secure environment for the pilgrims. Now, in that respect, what we need to keep in mind that pilgrimages in medieval society were an extremely important feature. They are an important feature in other societies too, right up to the present time in Muslim societies, where a religious Muslim is supposed to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to the holy sites of Mecca and Medina in his lifetime. Otherwise, he might not fare all that well on the other side when he, in other words, in order to qualify as a good Muslim, you have to make the pilgrimage. So it was a little bit like that in the Middle Ages. People felt that they had to go to the Holy Land on the pilgrimage, which of course also had a symbolic significance because to use a bad word for it, sort of the electricity, the juice, was going out of Christianity. And so this symbolically manifested in the desire to go back to the origins where it started and to try to recapture some of the energy that might have been there at the time of Jesus. That was the rationale. And so there was a tremendous amount of pilgrimage going on, and when the pilgrims were routinely menaced in this fashion, this became a great problem to all the peoples of Europe. Now, this long introduction is I gave to the statement that a number of semi-monastic knightly organizations, chivalric organizations, came into existence as the result of the Crusades. In fact, the great powers sort of each had their own knighthood, their own knightly order that originated during the Crusades. The Germans had the Teutonic Knights, the Teutonic orders. The Italians had the Order of Malta. which also had other names, the Order of St. John of Malta, and the French had the Order of the Temple, the Templar Order. Now, the Templar Order became very important in France. It was championed by one of the great saints of the Catholic Church, and by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the second founder of the Cistercian order, an astonishing individual who got together a whole bunch of his own relatives who were all knights, and who told them that it would be a great and spiritual thing if they organized themselves in a knightly order, and this became the Order of the Temple, or les Templiers. And to this day, if you travel around pretty much all over France, but particularly the south of France, in every village, in every small town, you will find the old buildings of the Templars. Now they became a very important and very rich knightly order, and when you are rich and powerful, you will get some enemies. And the enemies of the Templar order eventually conspired against them. They got the French king, Philippe le Bel, beautiful Philip, who was anything but beautiful in his character, as their patron, and they did away with the Templars. They accused them of all kinds of things, and led by the then Grand Master Jacques de Molay and his leading knights were all exterminated. The Templar houses and then were taken away, and all the wealth of the Templar order was confiscated. Now, what you need to keep in mind is that by way of what happened to the Templars, a large segment of French society and a society of an upper caste, of nobles, of knights, knightly families, and families that would have knights in their ranks, came to be gravely hurt. And so an enmity arose against the Catholic Church, and to some extent against the French monarchy, because of what had been done to the Templars. Almost every noble family in France had someone in the family who had been a Templar and who probably had been executed, or to say the least, had been deprived of his property. So there was a strong undercurrent of opposition to the status quo. While on the other hand, more and more among the common people, and perhaps to some extent more in regions like in the Languedoc, where all the populace was similarly disaffected with the northern French and with the government and with the king, because of what had been done to the Cathars. So from then on, from the 13th century onward, 14th century onward, there was an undercurrent in the French psyche, in the soul of the people in the countryside, which was severely critical of the Catholic Church, and which extended that criticism to the royal power. I mention this, why? I mention this because such feelings can persist and throughout the ages and break forth many years later, but they are still there. Resentment, revenge, hatred, disaffection are feelings that have a long lifespan. You can notice it, we have to watch these in ourselves. If we cultivate vengeful feelings and anger against others, these feelings remain with us and work havoc years and decades after there is no longer really any justification for them. Why? Because they are part of the shadow of the dark component of human nature. We are all potentially vengeful rascals. And we have to watch that. So things that happened hundreds and hundreds of years later in France are possibly, and according to some fairly well-informed folk, to be traced back to the two great wounds that have been inflicted on the French psyche, namely the defeat and the extermination of the Cathars and the defeat and extermination of the Knights Templar. These were ghosts that came back to haunt France and ultimately, possibly, at least in part, became responsible for the French Revolution. Now you may say that those are big words, and how do I come up with such crazy ideas? Well, I am an expert in crazy ideas, so I do come up with them. But you know, there have been stories which, while possibly not historically correct and true, but still tell something very important. And one of these, which actually some fairly important people mentioned in their books, subsequently, that when the execution of King Louis XVI took place during the Reign of Terror, when the king was led up to the guillotine, an old man with a great beard, some old strange person, stood up and yelled, "This is the revenge of Jacques de Molay." And that somehow that, there was, at least at the sentimental level, that there was a connection between the great uprising against the establishment, both ecclesiastical and secular in France, and what went on hundreds and hundreds of years before. Now, this may or may not have a great deal of, these statements may or may not have a great deal of merit, but they have some merit. And we need to keep in mind also that both of these movements that were so cruelly and so thoroughly extinguished back in the Middle Ages had esoteric underpinnings, so that a natural conjunction occurred, let us say, between certain esoteric traditions and the persecuted people who themselves were, to a greater or lesser extent, motivated by esoteric connections, such as the Cathars and the Templars. So a very dangerous, a very destructive component entered French society by way of these two persecutions, which in all likelihood had at least something to do with subsequent developments, such as the French Revolution itself. So let's just put it that way, there was a fertile ground because of historical precedents to the possible return, the possible rising to the surface of esoteric currents, of spirituality that had become radically disaffected with the Catholic Church and also with the secular government of France. And the time came when they came forth in great and bloody retribution. Now, once again, to what extent these interpretations are correct, I cannot say, but let's say the people who have mentioned them in their books, esoteric people and so forth, all seemed to know something and seemed to accept this explanation of these historical developments to a considerable extent. In any event, there was a dangerous element that entered French history, which eventually then it itself exploded. This is all background to our actual subject matter, which is really the 19th century occult revival in France. Now, we need to remember that maybe by now we need to turn on the air conditioner again. I'm sorry, I was the one who requisitioned its turning off.
Maybe speak a little louder.
And make a little louder too. Maybe when it's cooler, then I'll be able to speak louder, huh? Okay. All right, as loud as we can. Let's say a lot of things happened. The French Revolution happened, and by the way, just because I'm putting forth these strange stories doesn't mean that I'm a great friend of the French Revolution. My great-grandfather was an Austrian military officer and had various other offices, was caught by way of his travels in Paris during the Reign of Terror. And let's say he didn't have anything good to say about the French Revolution. And his letters and journals that we read, which among others contained the fact that he walked for days, ankle deep in blood, on the streets of Paris, were not the kind that would endear that particular historical phenomenon to a person. So, enough about that. What am I to do? Oh, good God. Well, I guess when you get old, you lose your voice too. See? In any event, let's say there was an ongoing problematic constellation of spiritual, political, and historical forces in France, which endured and which, let's say, was ultimately not to the benefit of the French people. Now then, however, let's see what happened. I think on the whole it might be said that a fairly large segment of the French populace, of all social stratifications and classes, had become disaffected with the Catholic Church. And that therefore there was a desire, a longing, a searching for spirituality of a somewhat different nature. The Catholic Church had discredited itself by way of the persecution of the Cathars and of the Templars, and very large numbers of French men and French women did not trust the Catholic Church again. And therefore the time was ripe for other spiritual currents to arise, where people might find some entry into the greater worlds, and where their religious, spiritual longings and desires would be at least in part fulfilled. And this is what happened then in the 19th century revival. Now, I'm going to depart from my notes, which has always been useful to me in the past. I'm going to get a little bit ahead of myself, and you might say there were two very important developments which brought the esoteric tradition into prominence within a French context. And they were not really related to each other, except way at a level of subjects. And one of these was literary, and in other words, certain books were published, which then became a very important source, not only in France, but in many other places, as I'll tell you, of people who were seeking information, inspiration within the esoteric tradition. And that was one. The other was, you might say, of a less theoretical nature, and had more to do with mystical, magical, transformative developments of the individual. So really a certain kind of spirituality within which the individual himself would be inspired and ultimately transformed. Now, it's easier to talk about books than about people, because books are just like an open book. Books have their content, and you read it and you study it and you form certain conclusions. Now, the literary revival of Esoterica in France, and really by extension in many other countries by way of that inspiration, came all about as the result of the insights, the activities of one man. This man was born in the around the turn of the 17th and the 18th century, at the time of the Revolution, and his name was Alphonse Louis Constant. He was a middle-class Frenchman who, like most middle-class Frenchmen who wanted to study something seriously and to become scholars, was pursued by him initially through ecclesiastical lines, which means that he became a seminary and was being trained for the priesthood. Now, while in the seminary, he ran afoul of some disciplinary situations. Heaven knows what they really were. But the fact of the matter was that he, even though he was already ordained to the diaconate, which is the step right below the priesthood, he left the seminary and reverted to private life. In the course of his leaving the seminary and undertaking a new life, he became extremely interested of all things. Here is a French Christian young man who was a seminarian, was going to become a priest, and so he became tremendously interested in mystical Judaism. And in order to fit the image, shall we say, he changed his name and translated each one of his individual components of his name into Hebrew. So his name was Alphonse Louis Constant. Alphonse changed into Eliphas. Louis he changed into Levi. And Constant in Hebrew is Zahed, so he now became Eliphas Levi Zahed. And he became a an extremely astute and diligent student and scholar of what? Of the Kabbalah, or as in Hebrew it is pronounced Kabbalah. And he wrote 2 big books that became tremendously influential, which are both Kabbalistic and magical, and I'll tell you what the magical meant at that particular time. And the first one was called the Dogme et Rituel de la Magie Haute, the teachings and the rituals of high magic. And this was an extremely important book and still is. The English translations usually were a little bit, the title was a little bit shorter, and if you see somewhere just a book named Transcendental Magic, that's the one. It doesn't have dogma and ritual in it like the French version. The other one, which was published by him a little later, was the L'Histoire de la Magie, the history of magic. But the truly seminal work was the work on transcendental magic. Now, in order to understand to some extent what this man was about, he used the word magic as an umbrella term, really, for the esoteric tradition. And he had fairly good reason for that, because who are the mystery people whom one never really finds out much, except they come and they leave some gifts and then they go in the Bible, in the New Testament, but the 3 magi, the 3 magicians. Where do they come from? Where do they go? We really don't know. But let's say the common opinion of the populace was that the 3 magi came from Persia. Now, in Persia, the Persian religion, by then the religion of Zarathustra, the prophet, was frequently referred to as the Magian religion, and its advocates, magi. Once again, I'll mention that I undoubtedly mentioned other times that one of the reasons for that is that the term magic, magi, and everything with an M-A-G is a cipher, and it is the cipher to greatness. Much of it has to do with an island, in the Greek island, in the Mediterranean, where else would it be, that is called the island of Martinism. And on the island of Martinism, among other things, you always found a great deal of lodestone in the natural environment, which is a magnet. Now, what does a magnet do? You take a magnet and you bring little iron shavings or other pieces of metal together, and the magnet draws them all together. So the magnet is something that enlarges under certain conditions. And so the word of magnum in Latin, from which we get all kinds of English words like magnitude, magnification, magnanimous, all of that. All of this became a buzzword describing activities that would contribute to enlargement of something. Now, what was being enlarged? What was being enlarged? What today we call consciousness. Enlarged what today we would call our practical knowledge of the spiritual environment, not just the physical, but the non-physical. So because if we learn about these things, we learn about the other regions which can be reached only by special means and so forth, what the Gnostics would call the aeons. When we do that, we are enlarging our consciousness. And so Eliphas Levi picked the word magic to indicate that there is an underlying, an ancient and very powerful tradition that if practiced, studied and practiced in the proper fashion, would enlarge our consciousness, would enlarge our soul. We even say that magnanimous is to have a great soul. And that therefore, sort of to Eliphas Levi, and I don't think he ever really said this out in the open verbally so much, but it is implied in his writings that there is a secret religion, so to say, and that is the religion of magic, la magie. And by way of the study and the practices of this secret religion or tradition, the soul, because the term consciousness was not used in those days, the soul of the human is enlarged, that we can be more than what we think we are. We can, our character, our nature can be enlarged, and then we will be wise, we will be magi. And this became the origin, this teaching became the origin of, and one of the most important features of the magical tradition. Levi was a quiet scholar. He lived in a little apartment in Paris. He wrote his books, and as far as he did become a Freemason, just for the information of those who are brothers in the lodges who may be here, but other than that, he just wrote, never went anywhere. There's one story about him that is more in the nature of action than of scholarship. There was an English lord, well, there were many English lords, but there was an English lord by the name of Bulwer Lytton. That's one name. And Lord Bulwer Lytton had a great interest in the occult. Blavatsky was very fond of the writings of Bulwer Lytton. Well, Bulwer Lytton read Eliphas Levi's books, and he said, well, that's all well and good. The old Frenchie there wrote some interesting books, but you know what? I would like to see how this is done. How does one do any magic? So he contacted Eliphas Levi. Undoubtedly, Levi was of very modest means. He probably offered him a good stipend, and he asked Levi to come over to London, which he did. And now he said, all right, Monsieur Levi, what I want you to do now, I want you to do some magic that I can see and that I can participate in. Then I will believe that you wrote something that was true. And Eliphas Levi said, well, yes, so your lordship, what do you want me to do with magic? What do you want me to do? So he said, well, invoke some important person who has been a powerful part of the esoteric tradition. So Eliphas Levi thought a little bit, and he said, well, how would it be if I invoked or evoked somebody from the great teachers in Alexandria, because the Alexandrian teachers were still held in great reverence. Bulwer Lytton said, sure. So Levi organized an invocation or evocation. They all have their own particular meanings, technical meanings, but that really doesn't matter, of Ammonius Saccus, the Neoplatonic philosopher who founded the Neoplatonic school, one of the great wise men of Alexandria in the Alexandrian period. And apparently the magic worked. Somebody came and spoke to Levi and to Lord Bulwer, and Lord Bulwer-Lytton was very impressed. So he let Levi go home to attend to his business, but he said, yeah, now I know what this magic can be. All right. What?
What did he say?
What did he say? Oh, a little bit of that is available, but Bulwer-Lytton did not write down in detail what the spook, the spirit, the spirit of the Alexandrian wise men told him, but apparently he was quite satisfied with the communication. So let's say Eliphas Levi was not, as one might assume, purely a theoretician, but he certainly knew that magical rituals worked, but he did not particularly advocate them. He said that it's much better to be well informed about the mystery of the mysterious worlds, of the kind of entities that are ordinarily invisible and that may come as the result of magic. In other words, learn how magical life is and how magical the universe is. If you learn that, then you have learned a great deal. And the actual magical invocations or evocations are not that important, but the important thing is to know the magical universe, let's say. Now, Eliphas Levi's contribution to the, and this went on throughout the early part of the 19th century. Eliphas Levi died in 1875, which was a very portentous year for. And I'll mention to you some of the things. Eliphas Levi died in 1875. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875. The Theosophical Society was founded by Blavatsky and Olcott and their associates in 1875. Do you want more? I can probably come up with more. In any event, and if you don't mind, because I don't really have anything against the guy, but a lot of people do. Edward Alistair Crowley, of controversial memory, was born in 1875, for which reason he immediately, once he was out in the public, he immediately said, obviously, since he was born in 1875, he was a reincarnation of Eliphas Levi. Well, Brother Alistair, I doubt it. But that makes really no difference. In any event, it was a great year. So, in any event, let's say a whole how should one call it? A tremendous upsurge of interest, both literary and practical, in the subject matter of Levi's work arose, and a number of really very important people who wrote about these matters, one of them being Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, and another one being the great American, what should we call him? I think Manly Hall called him the Plato of Freemasonry, General Albert Pike, who wrote the normative book on Scottish Rite Masonry, and he is really the father of philosophical and spiritual Masonry. All of these people quoted like you wouldn't believe from the books of Eliphas Levi. Now you got to remember that in the 19th century there were no copyright laws. And people copied from each other. And they often didn't acknowledge that. So Blavatsky herself and others, they wrote paragraphs and pages that were verbatim copies from the books of Eliphas Levi in their own writings. And Blavatsky paid, she may not have acknowledged all the quotation, but she paid very high praise to Eliphas Levi. Now, that's not everything. I could be here for a long time talking about old Eliphas, but I have to talk about some other people as well. But let us say he introduced a number of individual elements which were part of his magical picture of the universe, which continued to sort of have their own life in the world and society. And one of that being the tarot. So we own, let's say, the great initial pioneering work on the tarot cards to Eliphas Levi. But there were other French people involved also. There was a man named Kurt de Gebelin who attributed an Egyptian origin to the tarot, but I would say without much warrant. But Eliphas Levi's great contribution was that because of his great devotion to the Kabbalah, he made a correlation between the 22 paths, as they are often called, channels of the tree of life of the Kabbalah, and the 22 cards of the major arcana of the tarot. So the Kabbalistic approach to the tarot is almost entirely due to Eliphas Levi. You can see now why Aleister Crowley would have been happy to be able to claim legitimately to be his reincarnation. In any event, Levi really did much more than just write about magic, but to him the word magic was an umbrella term for the esoteric tradition, of which the tree of life of the Kabbalah and various teachings associated with it was a very, very important component. So take it from me, almost everything that is worth anything and that is still around in books or on the TV, on the computer screen or so about Kabbalah and about tarot goes back to Eliphas Levi. So Levi certainly was not interested in teaching magic tricks, but he called a particular worldview, the way what in German we call Weltanschauung, a cosmo-conception as Max Heindel would have called it, a way to understand the world and life, which is of a magical nature and which you can understand and practice by way of the Kabbalah. That if you really understand Kabbalah and know the intricacies, so to say, of the tree of life, you really can understand life. It's not called Etz Chaim, the tree of life, for nothing, because it tells of life. And so we might say practically all of the revival of Kabbalistic learnings, and for the first time outside of the rabbinical circles of Judaism, goes back to Eliphas Levi, a very, very important influence. Almost anything along the esoteric lines after that time, after his life, bears a relationship to the work of Eliphas Levi. So that was the literary, let's say, the literary revival of the esoteric tradition. But, you know, the French are very practical people. My association, I never lived in France, I lived in Belgium, and but I have been around French people, and especially at the time when I was going to school in the university in Innsbruck in Austria. This was at the time when I went to school. There was in the French occupational zone. See, Austria was divided like Germany into a very occupational zone. Unfortunately, Russian, I don't know why I mentioned them first, but you know, Russian, British, American, and French. And so I was around French people quite a bit at that time. So what needs to be kept in mind was that there were people in France who may or may not have been particularly aware of the literary occultism of Eliphas Levi, who had their own approach. And among these were two who really made a big imprint. The first one was a man of Spanish-Portuguese descent, who also had lived for a considerable period of time in Haiti, because you know Haiti was a French colony. That's why the people there still speak a kind of French. I don't know whether Haitian French would be greatly endorsed by Parisians or something of that sort, but it is French. Let's say, and his name was Don Martinez de Pasquale. Now, this was an very interesting man. This is all now late 18th century, before the turn to the 19th century, before the French Revolution. Don Martinez de Pasquale discovered, I'm sure he would be very angry if we said that he made it up, but let's say he discovered a form of magic. I don't know whether he and Eliphas Levi would see eye to eye or not, but a form of magic which he called it by various names, but he called it angel magic. So what he was doing was that he had the ability, with his techniques and his character, he had the ability to converse with angelic beings. And these angelic beings in turn were instructing him in various matters in which he was interested. And among them, it appears, according to the writings that he had and the traditions that he handed over to his friends, that these angelic beings had communicated to him a cosmology, a cosmoconception, which had to do with the fact that we humans have lost our integrity and our unity. And he connected it somewhat like the fall in paradise. Our consciousness has fallen, and our consciousness does not have the kind of integrity whereby we can see really great, important, transcendental things. We are not smart enough. We're a bunch of Dummkopf, in these spiritual matters. But these angels, who for the most part were They identified themselves by name, but to my knowledge, the names were not the names of the biblical angels, but these angels in turn were teaching Don Martinez de Pasquale various practices, magical practices, by which the mysterious reunification of the fragmented human mind and the human soul could be brought about. His principal teaching was that we are not whole, we are not complete, that something happened to us. Whether it happened in the Garden of Paradise or anywhere else doesn't matter, but we are spiritual cripples. That's my expression. I don't think such a dignified gentleman would have used it. But anyway, and therefore the angels were communicating to him various practices, various magical rituals, which could advance the reunification of the human being, so that the human being would reacquire the kind of integrity that it had at one time, so that we no longer would be spiritual cripples, but we would have a great deal of power to know, to understand, and what to do, and so forth. In other words, nowadays we would call it a real radical increase of consciousness. All right. Incidentally, there are still followers of Don the Pasquales in the world, and they are often referred to as the anyway, it's more magical. Martinez de Pasquale's followers. Now, Martinez de Pasquale attracted to himself number of deserving French people, among whom there was a Frenchman by the name of Louis Claude de Saint-Martin. And Saint-Martin agreed with Martinez de Pasquale about the basic condition that the human has been somehow spiritually crippled. But he felt that the way to overcome that would be by certain means that we could describe more as mystical than as magical. So he wrote, and they are still available. I was tempted to bring I have a beautiful antique set of the writings of Louis Claude de Saint-Martin in French, but I was a little bit afraid to bring them down. I thought, what if the coyotes get it, or something? But I will bring one or two of the volumes to show you how beautiful they are. These are all highly poetic meditations, whereby the mystical consciousness of the individual may be stimulated, and this in turn would be conducive to the reintegration, as he called it, and also Martinez de Pasquale called it, the reintegration of the human being, of the human soul, that we would become whole again. And when we become whole, then we are right there with the angels. Then we know, not otherwise. Now, our good friend de Pasqualis then left, and and Louis Claude de Saint-Martin was no longer his disciple, but he gathered disciples of his own. So we might say that there were two approaches then. that came out of that particular school, one being theurgic, magical, that of the Pasqualis, and the second mystical. Now, I'm sure that by now I have used up a tremendous amount of time. Yes, I have. So, Louis Claude de Saint-Martin was of a noble family. He was a military officer under the king, and when the revolution broke out, he was stranded somewhere in the south of France, but he received, this was his end, he received news that by then the reign of terror was raging in Paris, that the revolutionaries were looking for him, and that there was actually a contingent of people coming from Paris to get him. So he wasn't too anxious to meet the Red Lady in the guillotine, and conveniently died. So by the time the Jacobins have arrived to get him, all they could find was his dead body, which I am sure had magical, mystical origins. But by that time, he had gathered a considerable number of students, and whom he gave certain initiations to, and who then were told and instructed by him to engage in various practices which were primarily of an introspective, meditative nature. So he was a teacher of meditation, and one would say, if one wishes to classify him among the others, he was less of a magician and more of a mystic. And the people whom he gathered around him became known as les Martinistes, because they were the followers of Louis Claude de Saint-Martin. And they carried their initiations, their practices, their meditations with them, and in a very careful and very discreet manner passed these on to others. So there was, let's say, an informal association which nevertheless had certain formal aspects of those people who followed Louis Claude de Saint-Martin and who were working in their own souls for the reintegration of the human. Now, if you are interested, because brevity in these matters of reading matter is often a great virtue, if you get hold of the present, this year's summer issue of Quest magazine, if you can't get it, I'll get it from you from the publisher. And in this current issue, where of course I also have an article, it's a reprint from earlier, but you know, I may be permitted to push my own material a little bit now and then, right? But my article. My article is called Wise Men from the East, and it's about the legend of the spiritual masters and evaluation sort of that. But this is by a gentleman whom I don't know. It's very strange that there are still people left in this field whom I don't know. That's very, very strange. But undoubtedly they know me, even though I don't know what the heck. But who writes a very fine article about Louis Claude de Saint-Martin in much more detail and much more wonderfully stated really than I could. So in any event, from then on there was a sort of a rumor, occult rumor in France, that there are these strange people who do a lot of meditating and so forth, and they are called les Martinistes, namely those who followed Saint Martin. Now, sometimes you also hear there are still some followers of Martinez de Pasquale too, but they are often referred to as the Martinezist followers of Martinez, but his followers. So let's say they developed an informal fraternity of those who followed the teachings and the practices of Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, who, among other things, let us say what was one of his great inspirations, probably much more so than the Portuguese gentleman from Haiti, was Jakob Böhme of the German mystical tradition. He learned good German and he translated the works, several, not just the Aurora, which is the biggest, of Jakob Böhme into French, which was an immense shot in the arm of a French esoterica. So he was, let's say, even as Böhme, he was primarily a mystic, but with highly esoteric overtones. After his death, as time went on, his followers came together more often, and the followers of the dead Saint Martin became known increasingly as Martinists. They developed their own rituals, and they had their own meditations, and there are several branches of the Martinist order in existence till the present time. Their color, probably following somewhat in the foot of the Templars, their colors are black and white. They wear a white garment, a white alb, with a black cape over it, and a sword. Well, I better not talk too much because it may become too apparent that I know a little bit more about it than anybody would who is not himself a Martinist. In any event, there are several branches of the Martinist order. So in any event, from then on it was a more formal organization. There were initiations and there were Martinist groups who met, and that has continued to the present time. It was one of the prime mystico-magical associations of France to the present time. Very, very important and really very, very interesting. Now, I need to go further as quickly as I may. Among the people who became interested in Martinism and all of these things, by the time that the century rolled on, and it came now to 1875, and thereafter, the end of the 19th century, was a young medical doctor by the name of Dr. Gérard Encausse. Lived in Paris most of the time, and he took, because he was quite a writer, and he did remind me, I'm just going to run over some of his accomplishments, which are great. Let's say he needed a nom de plume, even a writer's name, even as Eliphas Levi was not Eliphas Levi, but Alphonse Louis Constant. Dr. Gérard Encausse, literary name was just one name, Papus, P-A-P-U-S. It doesn't really have the name really doesn't have a great deal of meaningful connection with him, except that I understand from one Martinist friend that Papus was the name of a particular spiritual angelic entity that could be invoked, and so he took that name. In any event, in 1875, this young medical doctor wrote a letter to Eliphas Levi. Unfortunately, by the time the letter arrived to Eliphas Levi's apartment, the old gentleman had gone to the Kabbalist heaven. So he could never answer Papus's letter. But there was a spiritual connection. And Papus thereafter pursued, let us say, the Esoteric with a vengeance. He reorganized along his own insightful lines, and the Martinist order, which grew bigger and bigger under his leadership. He wrote a great many books. He was one of the early members of the Theosophical Society in France, and obviously knew H.P. Blavatsky quite well, and a very outstanding gentleman. I would be doing him an injustice if I did not mention that. He also, Papus was had the ability to discover important spiritual people, and he did make one great big discovery of someone who came to be known as the Master Philippe of Lyon. His real name, his total name was Nisier Antelme Philippe. So Philippe was his last name. He grew up as a little shepherd in the French Alps. His parents owned some land there, and subsequently he became, his biographer, who actually was Papus's son, Papus Fils, as we used to call him, wrote a book about him under his name, Maître Philippe, homme de guérisseur et homme de Dieu. He's a healer and a man of God. He was an astonishing individual, a living saint, who subsequently became sort of the patron saint of the Martinist order and the teacher and helper, initiator of Papus. Now, I have spoken to some people who were close to at least the tradition of the Maître Philippe, and they all revered him like a second Christ, although he would certainly not have accepted that. In any event, one of the things that I'll just throw in because of the worldwide fame in history about it, Papus, with his Martinist order, went to many places. One of the people whom he befriended were Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra in Russia. And when the Tsar had the imperial family finally had a Tsarevich, had a son, they discovered that little Alexei had a very bad case of hemophilia, and he would bleed like nobody's business. And then Papus brought over to Russia the Maître Philippe. And the Maître Philippe treated the Tsarevich, which means the Tsar's son, and usually then for a considerable period of time he was well. The Tsar Nicholas himself and one of the other Grand Dukes both became Martinist initiates, and in one of our chapels, which I will not mention right now, and the priest of which is an active Martinist, we have the icon of Tsar Nicholas the Martyr on the wall. I have been a Russophile monarchist since I was a little child. I don't know why. Some some Dummkopf at one time said that I was a reincarnated Russian and that I was there during the revolution. I have no knowledge of that, and I don't give a hoot. But let us say that also impressed me very greatly. And in fact, the Tsar had arranged for Maître Philippe to receive an honorary medical doctorate at a Russian university because of his healings, and I mean, this was a miracle worker. That he was a thaumaturg, there's just no doubt about it. The man did the most astonishing thing. For instance, he would, let me see which one of his feats was the one that I wanted to mention. In any event, he did very good work with the Tsar and his family. Then he went back to France, and then about 1909, so still prior to the outbreak of World War I, I'm grabbing all of these things out of memory, Maître Philippe himself passed away. But he was undoubtedly a great saint and a great healer. And he was a Russian medical doctor by order of the Tsar. In any event, Papus remained in close contact with the Russian imperial family. He went over several times, even after the death of Master Philippe. And among other things, it is fairly well known that when people hear that somebody is a magician, then just like Lord Bulwer-Lytton, they want to see some magic done. So there is a story which is fairly likely to be accurate, that he did an evocation of the father of Tsar, Alexander III, for Tsar Nicholas, and that he came and spoke, and Papus did the invocation, and the spirit of the dead Tsar more or less indicated that there are going to be big troubles, and that his son is likely to also be in trouble. But he said, be steadfast and be good, my son, and don't give in to the enemies. If they'll kill you, they'll kill you, but you remain yourself. You are the Tsar of all the Russians, which is what Alexander III would have done. In any event, so here was, I need to conclude the chapter on Papus. Papus incidentally wrote a large number of books. Probably his best known book that you all may encounter if you haven't done so already is called The Tarot of the Bohemians by Papus. It's a stupid title, if I may say so. And what he meant was Le Tarot des Bohémiens. A Bohemian is a gypsy. So it's the tarot of the gypsies, because the gypsies carried the tarot around. But the way some Dummkopfs translated it into English distorts it, because it's not the tarot of the Bohemians. You know who the Bohemians are? The Czechs. The Bohemians live in Prague and around there, So and the reason that the gypsies came to be called les Bohémiens in French was because nobody knows where the heck the gypsies came from. Nobody. The Hungarians called them Romanians, which they are not. Other people called them Bohemians, that they came from Czech country, but they didn't. But it stuck in the French language. In any event, it's one of his better known books that is still around. Now, to conclude the story with the Tsar, there came World War I, and the Tsar was out with the troops in the field, and Papus was back in France. He was way past the age, but he volunteered for the army in World War I, and he was a military surgeon in a military hospital. And while doing work in the military hospital, which was quite a long distance from the front line, something happened. They said it was an accident, an explosive device blew up in the hospital, and among other people killed Papus. The Martinists say, and on the basis of the Martinist tradition, that the accident, so-called, was arranged by a certain person who by that time was probably sneaking across the border from Switzerland to the others to Russia by the name of Lenin. So Lenin knew that Papus had a great deal of influence on the Tsar, and that he possibly might be of great importance to him. So Papus was in all likelihood killed. When Papus was dead, the Tsaritsa, because people always say Tsarina around here, a Tsarina is a female Tsar. A Tsaritsa is the Tsar's wife. Now you learned something extremely important that you're never going to forget, and that will redound to your perennial benefit for the rest of your lives. In any event, the Tsaritsa Alexandra sent a telegram, military telegram, to her husband Nicholas, who was out on the front, and said, "Papus is dead, now we are lost." Because Papus apparently made a promise to the Empress that as long as he was alive, he would be able to make arrangements so that the imperial family would not be harmed. But since they killed him, the disaster came. It's all strange but very interesting.
It's like with Rasputin.
Excuse me?
It's like with Rasputin.
Well, yeah, Rasputin, of course, Rasputin sort of took the place of Papus and of the Maître Philippe after a while. And he was a Russian, he was Siberian, he was a very different temperament, and certainly not the elegant French gentleman like Papus, but he also had his rules. The Romanovs liked mystical things, going clear back to the great Tsar Alexander I, who was openly a Rosicrucian. But let us say Papus was a world-renowned figure who had brought the occult, the magical tradition into prominence on the stage of the world. This, let's say, brings us to the fact that there were very important people who came from the occult tradition of France. And one of the last of these was Gérard Encausse, known as Papus himself. These are really quite important data. But I'll also throw in a little more. In conclusion, as I always say, in conclusion, and you're wondering when is he going to conclude? But let's say what also took place at that time was the fact that Papus was dead already, and let's say the French occult tradition had obviously attracted various people. And one of the people who, whenever possible, would go over to France and to Paris to visit with some of the French occultists was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who had a very good friend in Paris, who was born Lady Caithness in England and married a French nobleman, a Duc de Pomard. He was a papal duke. And one of the very last important actions of Madame Blavatsky was that she couldn't stand it anymore, I think, in England. So she came over to France. She stayed with the Duchess, and there wrote a magnificent new little mystical book, the textbook of mystical theosophy, The Voice of the Silence. More than that, it was that French trip of which the outcome was The Voice of the Silence that also I feel and some others feel that sort of originated a new direction in H.P. Blavatsky's own work, and she hoped that she would now be able to sort of write and teach the second chapter of Theosophy after the Secret Doctrine, which we have often called the mystical Theosophy, and of which the Voice of the Silence was, so to say, the first volume. But unfortunately her health couldn't stand it anymore and she died. So the Theosophical Society was very numerous, and they had a beautiful journal, was published in Paris, Le Lotus Bleu, the Blue Lotus. And to this day they have a very beautiful headquarters on Square Rapp, in which we had the good fortune to visit when we were in Paris, where I think it was built later than H.P. Blavatsky, but a lot of the, let's say, the convergence of the French occult tradition and the theosophical tradition came together. So let us say this was a lot of history, and a lot of details, maybe more than you were anxious to hear, but then I often tell you things that you are maybe not anxious to hear, and I'll tell it to you just the same. But let us say the upshot of it is that there was, for a long time, and certainly during the 19th century occult revival, there was a very, very powerful, very mystical, very wise French group of people of quite considerable numbers who brought forth and continued the esoteric tradition, and that therefore France has to be numbered among the great esoteric countries, and that it is important for us to remember that, let's say, the theosophical mystical tradition is not all English language. It's not all English and American. Although, of course, even when it was in India, it would have been English because everybody spoke English. Still do to a great extent. But the fact is that the French, with Claude, Louis Claude and other wise men, had to establish the solid tradition in the Martinist tradition, which is still there. And so there is this. It's important to remember that La Belle France is also La France occulte. It is the occult France, it is the mystical France, it is the Cathar France, it is the Templar France. It is one of the great spiritual centers of the world and of Europe, and has to be understood and regarded as such. And therefore I felt that it was important within this little series to pay homage to that particular branch of the tradition, and to recall the names of these truly illustrious and lovely people. That's one thing that I noticed, and I surely don't want to say anything bad about American theosophists, of which I guess I am one myself, or Germans with the Rosicrucian tradition, but there is something so endearing and so lovely when you read about these people. Papus must have been an absolutely lovely individual. Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, a great mystical genius, really belongs in there with the great saints and mystics of the world, right next to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux or others. And of course, the same thing, but en masse, as we would say in French, may be said about the Cathars, also about the Templar martyrs. So there's an important home of the esoteric tradition that should be revered, should be understood, we should pay homage to, and should study, because there is a great deal of highly insightful and informative and transformative material that has been put forth through these people who in many cases were really not just wise people, but holy people. Like Master Philippe was a holy man of the utmost power. So this needs to be remembered. So there is an important place there, and from time to time it brings forth great flowers, like Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, others, which we should recognize as being, let's say, related to our transcendental traditions, and to whom we should pay homage. And through the years and through the centuries, we should give thanks that they were here and contributed to the tradition. So let's sort of in our minds, or otherwise say now as a conclusion, merci bien, mes amis. Thank you very much.